for joining us today. I always say this, but it's true that there's a lot of things that grab our attention, especially this time of year, and I appreciate very much that you're willing to spend the next hour and a half with us talking about this important topic. The purpose of today's webinar is to give you an update as to where we are on our rulemaking process and kind of answer some questions, kind of show you like what we've learned from past discussions that we've had, where we're headed, and what we intend to do going forward. So, and as Lauren said, what my experience is that sometimes people ask questions and a couple slides later the answer is there. So if you want to wait to the end of each segment, I'll give an opportunity for people to kind of step in and ask questions then. Otherwise, waiting to the end is good. And of course, if there's something that I'm saying that makes no sense, you can ask me to go back a slide or two and I can explain it better. Okay, so let's see if I can share my slides. So Lauren, do you see my slide?
Yes, we do.
Good. All right. Well, welcome again. This is a discussion on resilient environments and landscapes. It's called the REAL Rule Amendments, and this is part of our NJPACT rulemaking efforts. This is the second phase in our land use regulation rulemaking efforts, and it has 5 main parts to it, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how this fits in with the proposal that's on the street today. So the biggest piece of it, really, and we're going to spend the most time discussing today, is how we intend, through this rulemaking, to adjust the coastal flood hazard area to account for rising sea levels, attendant storm surge, and extending our jurisdiction of the floodplain further inland, which means more people under the jurisdiction of the rules and higher first floor elevations, higher floodproofing, and so on. So we're going to talk about that. The second piece of this, which is a critical piece, relates to our relationship with FEMA and ensuring that everything that's in the flood hazard rules and the coastal zone management rules meet or exceed minimum NFIP requirements. And I'll explain to you why that's important and what we intend to do. The third theme or piece that we're going to cover today is how we are supporting renewable energy through amendments that will make the permitting process easier and facilitate certain types of things, but also balancing habitat conservation. The fourth is encouraging nature-based solutions, which really refers to how doing bank stabilization and shoreline protection using natural mechanisms, natural materials such as wood, rock, and whatnot, tends to be more resilient than using hard armoring and having head walls and whatnot. So there's an incentive that's been put into the rules to encourage folks to use nature-based solutions. And then also there are some attendant changes within the wetlands rules and the flood hazard rules that deal with water quality, particularly mostly in degraded or urban areas and headwaters. And then the fifth piece is how we're addressing some of our permitting process. There's a pathway for expediting certain projects through some new general permits by certification. And also there is some online reporting that I'll cover that we want to add so that we can keep track of applications and permits and whatnot a little bit better. So that's kind of the what of what we're doing, and I'm going to go obviously in more detail of that, but there's the why of what we're doing. And of course, we're driven and mandated to protect public health, safety, and welfare. But there's also the other side of that is the long-term economic resilience of the state. And study after study that has been revealed over the last several years shows that making good choices today and making investments today in a more resilient design means saving money later. And we saw this over and over again in the past where, as you might be familiar with the flood hazard rules, we add what we call 1 foot of freeboard to our flood elevation. So when you determine your flood elevation, 1 foot above that is where you set the lowest floor of your buildings, or to which you floodproof, or if you're building a road, that would be your target elevation. And that 1 foot is a form of resilience, right? It's saying we've calculated, or FEMA's calculated where the flood elevation is going to be, but that calculation is is based on what we know, the best available science that we have, and we could be overshooting or undershooting it. And so that 1 foot of freeboard gives you a safety factor. And we saw that a lot of folks after Sandy were protected because of just that 1 foot of freeboard. It would made that much of a difference. And some communities have adopted even greater freeboard. So cleaning up after a storm is a lot cheaper than having to elevate your house after a storm, right? So there's a lot of benefit in this. And it's not just because of storms, but it's also because of the human component to sea level rise. One estimate says that 13% of damages during Hurricane Sandy, over $8 billion, were due to human caused sea level rise across the metropolitan area. 3.78 billion in New Jersey alone. That's in the middle. That was the estimated range, but the range is between 2 and 7 billion. And about 24,000 people and 16,700 homes in New Jersey were exposed, predominantly because of anthropogenic sea level rise. So it's not just something that's happening, it's something that our emissions are contributing to. And a lot of financial institutions are picking up on this, right? The Federal Reserve has said that uncertainty shouldn't stand in the way of making prudent investments and risk management. Moody's, S&P, and Finch have all begun integrating climate vulnerability models into their municipal bond issuance. Realtor.com and Redfin are now having disclosure language because they want people to know, quote, the true cost of purchasing and maintaining the building, including the cost of insurance and repairing damage. In March, the Securities and Exchange Commission proposed new rule amendments on climate risk reporting and evaluation, which should be adopted next year. In November 2022, FEMA launched its Climate Risk and Resilience Portal to provide customers with direct access to information on critical impacts to buildings. And in April, the Federal Office of Management and Budget released the first federal budget exposure to climate risk report, including a new section that focuses on climate change. So everyone is recognizing the long-term economic impacts of not doing something, right? So this rulemaking is intended to help people be safer today and in the future, and also to help reduce the economic impact to the state as sea level rise and climate change continues to impact us. So the first theme, right, is kind of the biggest one we're covering, and there's two fundamental parts of that. There's what is inundated today versus what's inundated by sea level rise in the future, and then there's how that affects the 100-year flood elevation. So there's a change to the standard, and there's a change to the process. The standard is fixing sea level. It fixes sea level rise gaps, which means saying that we're not focusing on today's flood elevation, but the projected future flood elevation. And we're not looking at today's sea level, but we're looking at projected future sea level when designing projects. And then the process side of things, which is huge, is helping folks to know through disclosure, better disclosure, what kind of impacts they might see with development in these areas. And that's a critical piece to it, because if you think about just about anything in your life, the more well-informed you are, the better information that you have, the better decisions you make, right? So we want people to be able to make the best decisions for them, for their community, for their business, for where they live, where they work, and this is part of that process. A few things what this rulemaking does not do. It does not create a no build zone. There's not going to be an added area along the coast that you can't build in, right? It does not affect existing structures unless they're substantially damaged or substantially improved. So that's an important point to make, because sometimes in prior conversations that we've had where we talk about adding additional factors of safety to our flood elevation, people kind of interpret that as that where you're going to make everybody raise their houses 5 feet. You're going to make everybody raise their roads 5 feet. And not only is that not practicable, but the rules don't require that. It's only driven by development and redevelopment activities. And the third point relates to timing, is that the changes don't impede projects that what I'm saying is are already in the pipeline. In other words, submitted to DEP prior to adoption. So our anticipated time frame for this, we've on December 5th, we proposed the Inland Flood Protection Rule, which was a small piece of the overall package, and this is the rest of it that we're talking about today. So we proposed that in December, and we anticipate adopting that in the second quarter of 2023. And at the same time, we plan to propose this rulemaking that we're discussing. So if that's filed in the second quarter of 2023, then we're not going to have new rules in place until 2024. First quarter is the earliest that it would happen. Maybe it's second quarter. The Administrative Procedures Act and the process that's related to that, if we file a rulemaking and it's published in the New Jersey Register, then we have to file the adoption of that rulemaking within a year after it's published, or else we have to start over again. And sometimes we can get extensions if we're changing, making a substantial change, but we don't anticipate that. So all that to say is that all of the projects that are in the pipeline have at least a year, if not a little more than that, to adjust to these and to get in the door, and you wouldn't be affected by this rulemaking. So this is a graphic that I made a while ago that seems to be helpful for folks. And this kind of illustrates the interaction between the current sea level and the future sea level, the current floodplain and the future floodplain. So here's your current sea level, right? Here's your current shoreline, as you can see. And you can see this boardwalk and this person is outside of the water. Based on projections that we'll talk about, the shoreline will move inland as water comes up. So there's a bit of land between what the current shoreline is and the anticipated future shoreline that we're calling the inundation risk zone, because it's a zone that has a risk of inundation, whether it's permanent or whether it's twice a day because of high tides. So this is an area that's dry today, but will be underwater at some point in the future. And then the corollary to that is, here's today's 100-year floodplain, and here's tomorrow's 100-year floodplain. If sea level goes up X feet, then the floodplain is likely to go up at least X feet, maybe more than that based on wave action. And so what's important about this illustration is that this home here, for example, is outside the current 100-year floodplain, right? And I'll show you kind of this schematic here where you're looking, the top view is looking down on the same picture. So this individual, they're outside the floodplain. They probably don't need flood insurance by anyone, right? If you're outside a flood zone and you don't have a mortgage, no one's going to require you to get flood insurance. And we saw this happen with Hurricane Sandy, where a number of folks that were in the flood zone, once they paid off their mortgage, they dropped their flood insurance, and then they were in trouble when Sandy hit. So this family might feel that they're safe because they're outside that line, but as I like to say, the flood doesn't know it's supposed to stop at that line. And as sea level is increasing and flood elevations are advancing inland, more and more people will be at risk over time. So we want people to understand, maybe you're not at risk now, but there's a likelihood that you will be at some point in the future. Just to go back to this is important to note, is that you can see that by having these 4 different elevations, we've created 4 different zones, right? And we're not calling it zone 1 through 4 in the rules, but this is, I think, helpful to kind of understand how it works, right? You've got the current inundation area, which is the area that's underwater today. And then you've got your future inundation area, inundation risk zone, that's zone 2. Zone 3 would be the limits of today's floodplain, and zone 4 would be the limits of tomorrow's floodplain. And the reason why that's important is because there's different standards that apply in each of these cases. There's standards that apply today if you're doing in-water work, if you're putting docks and shoreline stabilization activities. And there's new standards that will be proposed for the inundation risk zone. There's new standards for the current flood hazard area and new standards for the future anticipated flood hazard area. So the first piece of this is, what part of the state is likely to lie with underwater at least twice a day or permanently by the end of the century. Now, we picked year 2100 as our planning horizon because it's our experience that buildings and bridges and roads and whatnot that are built today are likely to be here in some form in the year 2100. A lot of us live in homes that are more than 75 years old, and we see that the choices that people are making today affect the people that live in the homes or use the roads or rely on the bridges or the critical buildings in the future, right? So the first piece of it is to identify what area of land we're talking. And we've focused on, as I mentioned, the 2100 planning horizon, but also a moderate sea level rise scenario based on moderate emissions. And that leads to if you look at the statistics of it from the Rutgers staff report, there is a range of values and there's a range of likely values. And the likely value for the likely increase by the end of the century in New Jersey is between, I think, 2.1 and 5.1 feet of sea level rise. So we're taking the high end of that and we're saying, okay, any land that lies within 5 feet vertically of today's mean higher high water line will be in this inundation risk zone. And it's not an insignificant portion of the state. You can see this graphic. We've mapped it out for our own internal use and would post that not as a regulatory tool, but also just as a an informational tool so that folks can kind of see whether or not they're within that 5 foot rise or not. And really, this is all just predicated on the fact that as sea levels rise, more land is regularly or permanently going to be inundated. And more land inundated means higher flood elevations, and higher flood elevations mean more recurring flood damage. So here's another graphic that I created. I think that's a little bit easier to understand. Here's your current sea level based on your mean higher high water line. And anyone that's not familiar with that term, so we have high tides twice a day, and one is generally higher than the other. So the mean higher high water line is the average of the higher of the two high tides over a period of time. And so that gives you the mean higher high water line. And that's where we base a lot of things in our rules. And so that would be the current shoreline, right? Well, as sea level increases, if we're looking at a 5 foot increase in sea level elevation, that means the mean higher high water line is 5 feet higher. So that land between today's shoreline and the future shoreline is the inundation risk zone. And then there's the flood hazard area, right? Which, ranges between 9, 10, 11, depending where you are along the coast. Could be higher if you're a V zone. And then here's the future flood elevation. So we are anticipating that flood elevations will rise by 5 feet, just like sea level. And so the rule is predicated on putting standards in place that address these potential impacts. So what does this look like? The changes we believe will help to build resilience into projects for sea level rise and storm surge in new development and improve risk disclosure, right? So first is what we're calling the climate adjusted flood elevation, the CAFE. So instead of calling it the flood hazard area elevation like we do today, we're going to call it the climate adjusted flood elevation because it's adjusted for anticipated climate change. And that the CAFE extends slightly more inland than the existing 100-year zone. And I've got some maps that show you what that looks like. So that means that the first floor elevation has to be 5 foot higher or flood proofed 5 foot higher than today if it's, depending on what type of activity it is. And we'll cover that a little more closely. And there's always off ramps. I want to point out there's a recognition that it might not be possible to elevate a building or build a building 5 feet higher or floodproof it 5 feet higher or put a road in that's 5 feet higher. There's a recognition of that in the rules. So the way the flood hazard rules are generally structured is that it sets a high bar and then it says, well, but if you can make certain demonstrations, then you can meet an alternate standard that protects public safety, health, safety, and welfare, but also doesn't prevent the project from being built, because we're not trying to prevent things from being built. We're trying to make sure that they're built correctly and safely. So the second part is a risk assessment and evaluation of alternatives in the inundation risk zone. And when I say alternatives analysis, I don't mean like pursuing the no build alternative. I mean, what can be done on the property to ameliorate flood risk? And that's important because since the inundation risk zone is measured by land that lies within 5 feet of the mean higher high water line, you might be on the fringes of it, and you might only be 6 inches or 12 inches or 18 inches from being out of it, and you could raise the ground and take yourself out of the inundation risk zone. Or you might have a piece of property that's half in the inundation risk zone and half out, and you could accommodate your project partially or wholly in the part that's out. Well, that's going to ameliorate flood risk, right? So there's an ongoing conversation that we'll have with permittees during the process, during the application review process, to try to help things be safer, try to make sure that everyone understands the risks involved in doing the type of development that they want to do and where and how. And then there's the notice requirements. The flood hazard rules already have a somewhat robust noticing requirement so that when we issue permits for buildings in particular, that there's a notice that needs to be placed on the deed of the building, letting folks know this property is in a flood zone. It's likely to be inundated to this point. It's likely to be inundated by the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 100-year storm, whatever's the first inundation level. And that helps future home buyers, future business owners understand the risks and maybe understand their insurance requirements. Oh, this is in a flood zone. Okay, well, I need to pursue that. Or it's anticipated to be in a flood zone. Maybe I should look at flood insurance today, and so on. So getting in the weeds a little bit more, there's a term in the flood hazard rules that's called the design flood elevation. And the design flood elevation is the regulatory elevation that we use to determine where the floodplain is and also how people should build things. And along the coast, the design flood elevation is equal to FEMA's base flood elevation. And we always take the higher of any preliminary map or effective map. And we provide an opportunity for people to show us, in cases where the preliminary map is higher, there's an opportunity for folks to show us, well, on our site, we don't believe that the preliminary map is appropriate. We think the effective map is appropriate, or somewhere in between. So there's a process for that. But today, we say use the higher of the preliminary map or the effective map, and that's the extent of our floodplain. That's the design flood elevation. But then floors and the first floors of buildings and roads, to the extent that they can, have to be built 1 foot above that. That's that 1 foot factor of safety, the 1 foot of freeboard, right? So along the coast, if your flood elevation is 10 on the effective map and 11 on the preliminary map, you'd use 11 because it's higher. And then your first floor of your building would be 1 foot higher than that, would be 12. Well, with anticipated 5 feet of sea level rise, that would increase flood elevations by 5 feet. So the new design flood elevation along the coast would be equal to the FEMA published flood elevation, preliminary or effective, whichever's higher, plus 5 feet, and then still plus that 1 foot factor safety. So if you look at it, if you look at today's mapping, then that means your first floors or your roads would really have to be 6 feet above FEMA's flood elevation. Again, can't overstress how many accommodations there are to recognize in the rule that this might not be practicable in all cases. We understand that, especially when it comes to infrastructure. But to the extent that, let's say, a community is proposing a critical building like a new police station or a hospital or something, or a school, this will help inform the community as to what areas of risk are involved, what decisions they can make to ameliorate that risk, and so on. So here's what it looks like. And I'm sure you've probably seen this tool, NJ Flood Mapper. If you go to njfloodmapper.org, this is a great tool. You can pick different sea level rise scenarios. You can pick different flood elevations and whatnot. So I'm going to use this as an illustration to show what this looks like in Cape May. So here's just an aerial, the base map of Cape May today, right, with no sea level rise. And here's what the same thing looks like if you add 5 feet of sea level rise to it. So I'll toggle back and forth so you can kind of see that. So the land that's blue or green would be below that 5 foot sea level rise scenario. So this would be land that is underwater at least twice a day because of high tide or permanently, right? It's not an insignificant piece of land. And here's those two maps side by side so you can kind of compare it. So it's no surprise that some of these low-lying marsh areas here will be inundated. Some of the roadways that come in and out of the cities are inundated to a certain extent. And so when roadways are being improved or buildings are being replaced or elevated, this will help inform where it should be done and how it should be done. So then the flip side of that, right, the corollary, as I mentioned, is the flood hazard area. So this is today's FEMA 100-year flood. So that's the area covered in blue, light blue. The dark blue is just the ocean, so it doesn't show up as a floodplain. And the orange represents the extent of the 500-year flood in these areas. So if you compare that with if you add 5 feet to the flood elevation, you can see it goes further inland. So this orange here represents the land that would be newly added to the 100-year flood elevation by raising it 5 feet. These brownish areas here represent V zones and open waters and whatnot, so that there's perhaps additional impacts in those areas, but it's mostly in the low-lying marsh areas. So side by side, you can see these two maps. So here's today's 100 years blue, the 500 years orange, and here's the future, the blue. The dark blue is the 100-year, and then you can see the extent of the +5. It goes beyond the 500 in a lot of cases. So I mentioned that there are design standard changes, but there's also procedural differences, right? And there's differences between how we look at development in the inundation risk zone and how we look at development in the overall coastal flood hazard area. So in the inundation risk zone, again, this is areas of land that we anticipate will be regularly or permanently underwater due to sea level rise. There are three pieces to it. One is what we're calling a climate impact assessment. And that's a narrative prepared by the applicant or their consultant that focuses on the purpose of the project, what kind of risks are associated with the project, what can be done to ameliorate those risks. And it's not a decisional tool, but it's for noticing requirements. And so a lot of the information that's in that climate impact assessment, if you go to the bottom where it says risk acknowledgement, that's a narrative that would be placed within the deed of a building, or if it's mostly it would apply to buildings, I suppose, if it's deeds, then that would be put into the deed so that people understand this climate impact assessment has occurred. Here's what the applicant has identified, and again, it just speaks to making sure that people understand the potential risks and can make good choices on where to live, where to work, where to buy. Well, the intermediate piece here that I skipped over, the climate risk alternatives analysis. Again, it's not looking at alternatives that would make you build somewhere else. It's looking on-site design alternatives that would help reduce, avoid, or minimize the risks. And it's focused mainly on residential and critical buildings. We're not requiring that risk assessment for commercial development, for recreational or entertainment development, hospitality and gaming along the coast. So this is looking at where people are living and looking at where people are relying on critical services like fire, first responders, fire stations, police stations, schools, hospitals, facilities where people would gather during a flood, like evacuation routes, things like that. Now, in the overall coastal flood hazard area, which is being expanded, it's a less of a detailed process, right? There's no climate impact assessment there. There's no risk alternatives analysis. Of course, we're always going to have that conversation with applicants about how to improve their designs so that it ameliorates flood risk wherever you are in the floodplain, just like we do today. And then there will be what we call a short form on risk acknowledgement. So you're not in the floodplain today, or maybe you're in it today, but you're going to be inundated by additional floodwaters. So this would be recorded in the deed of the property to say, this is what the flood elevation is today. This is what the state of New Jersey anticipates it'll be in the future. Here's the potential risks, and that way you're more well informed. So I'm going to just pause for a second because I covered a lot, and the last four are a little shorter. But the first one was very big and covered a lot of ground. So I want to just give everyone an opportunity. If there's anything that you need me to clarify or to cover about what we've covered so far, this would be a good time. You can raise your hand if you want to, or you can wait till the end.
All right, we have Ray Cantor.
Okay, hey Ray, how you doing?
Hey, Vinny, is this just questions of clarification, or is this the comment period as well? I mean, can I make statements, or are you just looking for clarification?
This is your time. We're here for you so that so everyone can understand what our proposal includes. And so if you have questions, comments, that's fine, because it hasn't been proposed yet. So, we're in that pre-proposal stage.
Fine, appreciate that. So I know I have 2 minutes. I will go quick. One, on the sea level rise, it looks like you're saying you're relying on the staff report and using the 5-foot increase. As you probably know, I've been trying to sit down with you guys for 2 years now to talk about the science. I still have not gotten a meeting. I would still appreciate a meeting to talk about the science, because the staff report is not the latest science. We could go into the IPCC, NOAA, nature studies, everything else, but it's going to be very problematic if you use the staff report as your basis for your science. a question for you on shore protection standards. I'm assuming if you adopt a 5-foot standard, that all shore protection, including beaches and dunes, must now meet the new elevation standards based on that 5 foot. If that's the case, I'm not sure if beaches and dunes as shore protection measures will be able to be engineered to meet that. And even if they could be engineered to meet that, I no longer think they will be able to meet the cost benefit analysis required by FEMA, in doing so, which basically means there's no more shore. We could still pump sand to maintain, but at the end of that, I think we're basically saying no more shore protection projects, beaches and dunes, and therefore that's it. And that's why, by the way, I've been saying that we're ultimately calling for a retreat, because there'll be a deadline when there'll be no more. Maybe I think it's 30 years from now, whenever the current projects are due for, and have to be redesigned. Also, I'll just stop there right now. I have a number of other questions,
Sure.
but I would like to come in and talk to you folks at some point on the science.
Understood, and I appreciate that, and I think you raised an important question about shoreline protection. So a lot of the rule, the way it's structured today, and the way that it would be structured in this proposal is, here's the target, and depending on the type of activity and the risk associated with that activity, the risk associated with failure of that activity, there's recognitions and off ramps and whatnot. So I agree with you that there could be situations where you have a shore protection project that meets the current cost benefit analysis today based on today's 100-year elevation, but wouldn't do that if it's +5. So that's accounted for in this, because we don't want to prevent projects from happening. We just want to make sure that they're as safe as possible. So that's a very good point. And I should also note too, and I don't think I noted this before, that this presentation obviously is going to raise a lot of questions. I can't cover everything in the rule proposal. The rule proposal is like 1,100 pages long at this point. And so I'm trying to hit the sort of the main points to it. But all that to say that in January, we will be available to meet to discuss more targeted points of this based on questions that were raised today or questions that come in. So if you represent anyone on the call, if you represent an entity or a community that you have specific concerns about, we will make time for you in January to talk about those concerns.
All right, that's the only one for now, Vince. I think maybe roll through the rest of them, and then we can take comments at the end point.
Okay. Well, I might take them in between, just because they're so different. And we'll see what happens when we get to the end of it. Thanks, Lauren. All right. And thanks, Ray. So the next piece is remedying FEMA's concerns about our consistency with the National Flood Insurance Program. This is huge, right? So probably letting folks, you probably are well aware of this, everyone on the call, but just in case you're not, FEMA has, through its National Flood Insurance Program, established minimum federal requirements. And the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, is a voluntary program. So communities in the country voluntarily agree to meet or exceed those minimum standards, and they have a flood ordinance that incorporates that, or sometimes they incorporate higher freeboard standards or whatnot. And that helps makes those communities eligible to receive certain disaster relief money after storms, as well as federally backed flood insurance for its residents and businesses. So nearly every community in the state of New Jersey participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, that's on the community level, but on the state level, we've had since 1929, one form or another, flood hazard rules. We used to call them stream encroachment rules and other flood hazard rules, but the enabling statute was adopted in 1980, and so we've had a lot of changes since then, but we have had this statewide program. And the statewide program, in most cases, it equals or exceeds FEMA's minimum standards. But in May of 2020, FEMA released a report that kind of took a deep dive on the flood hazard rules, because there were some places where permits could be issued that didn't meet minimum NFIP standards. And then that creates a complication on the local level, it creates a complication for FEMA. So in other words, let's say that you're in a community and you have a certain standard. You've got your floodplain ordinance that says this is what you have to meet, and the state issues a flood hazard area permit, and you're aware that the state program is generally more protective than the minimum NFIP standards. You look to that and say, well, if the state said it's okay, it must be okay. But the state has certain off-ramps in the program, like through a hardship process or in our mapping protocols that could lead to us issuing a permit that doesn't meet minimum NFIP standards. So we can't have that, right? Because that sets up the community for failure, that sets up the state for failure, sets up the folks that are making the investments for failure. So what this rulemaking will do will address every place that FEMA has identified as being a potential place of disconnection between our state program and the minimum NFIP requirements. So that way, when we do issue a permit, it will meet or exceed all those minimum standards. Now, important note to make, the proposal that is on the street right now that we're in the comment period for, the Inland Flood Protection Rule, that includes in 2 places, in section 6.7 of the flood hazard rules and in subchapter 10, language that says we're not going to issue a general permit or general permit by certification, permit by rule, or individual permit that doesn't meet minimum NFIP standards. So there's that blanket language that's already been proposed that you can comment on now. We're in the 60-day comment period, which ends, I think, February 3rd. But then the next piece will go in and address all the little specific places where there could be inconsistencies throughout. All right, any questions on that piece?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. The next piece is supporting renewable energy through amendments that will say balance the habitat conservation with new infrastructure demands. And this relates a lot to offshore wind and the support infrastructure, right? So if you're planning an offshore wind facility, you have to get a cable from the facility to the land, and that cable necessarily goes through portions of the coastal zone. It might impact shellfish habitat. It might impact different areas where fishing is occurring and whatnot. So the rulemaking addresses that and puts in place standards for the transmission cables, makes sure that there's noticing requirements so that people know where they are, and it balances the habitat impact with the creating this renewable energy source, which is obviously very important. Lauren, I think you're right. I think we'll just I'll just go through the rest of this and we'll take questions at the end, and I can always go back and address any. I can go back to slides if anybody wants me to. So the next piece, it's kind of a blanket statement to say it's encouraging nature-based solutions. That's part of it. It also means stormwater management, and it means improved water quality in degraded areas and headwaters. So what does that look like? So nature-based solutions, as I mentioned, are techniques that we use along the shoreline, along bank stabilization and riverine systems that rely on rock, wood, vegetation, things that are more resilient than hard armoring. We saw this in riverine systems a lot, where 25 years ago, there's one place where 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I issued a permit, and I worked on a permit to hard armor this bank that was failing along a stream. And what it did was it deflected the water and caused erosion a couple hundred feet downstream on the other side that now has to be fixed, right? So having something that can absorb the energy, having the proper slopes, having vegetation that will be able to slow down the water, and so on, or along the coast the roots that will hold in place, that's really important for carbon sequestration, obviously for habitat, for wave attenuation, and it provides some recreational opportunities as well, because instead of having a seawall, you've got maybe better access to the shoreline. So there's a lot in the rule that streamlines the permitting process and encourages the use of these. And that's important to note, because the flood hazard rules, the coastal rules, were largely developed over the years to address development. And some of these types of activities that are beneficial don't fit neatly into the categories that we've created. So we're expanding categories, we're explaining things better, and we're trying to streamline the process. And another example would be increased resilience of wetlands through beneficial use of dredge material. So as I showed you before, that map that shows the areas in the marsh areas, the coastal wetlands along the coast that are maybe just barely above flood elevations today or water surface elevations today, but will be underwater because of sea level rise. By taking dredged material and placing it on those wetlands marshes and raising the land, you can now restore those wetlands, ensure their continued viability. And we've seen this work really well on the coast. There's been some great projects, and so it encourages those things. But there's also a piece of the Freshwater Wetlands Rules and the flood hazard rules that are related both to coastal and inland development that we call improving protection of our land and water resources. So first, there's stormwater management. And there's three pieces to this that are important and pretty big. One is requiring redevelopment activities to meet the same water quality standards as new development. Now, what I mean by that is that today, in order for the stormwater rules to be triggered at the state level, you have to be a major development. And a major development is a project that disturbs an acre of land or more, or cumulatively adds a quarter acre of impervious surface or motor vehicle surface. So you could have a situation, and I've seen this many, many times, where you have a 20-acre development that was historically there. It's all paved. There's a new development that's coming in that actually equals or shrinks the amount of impervious surface. And because of that, it doesn't trigger the water quality requirements in the stormwater rule, and there's no water quality benefit that's required. Now, reducing the impervious surface obviously has a benefit in itself of water quality treatment. But what we're seeing, and we've heard over and over again, ever since we started this conversation pre-IDA and then even more so after IDA, is that we could adopt the most protective, stringent, wonderful regulations that we could devise for new development, and it's not going to address our water quality issues, and it's not going to address our existing flooding issues unless we do something with redevelopment, right? So we feel that there's a missed opportunity to require redevelopment activities to meet some level of water quality provisions as new development would be, right? The second piece is to promote retention of stormwater runoff on site. Now, there are places where, now the rules today, of course, have recharge requirements where you have to collect in a certain amount of water and put it back in the ground. There are provisions for retention ponds and whatnot to hold water, but we're seeing that there's a nexus between water quality and flood damage and sort of these repetitive small level storms. So by trapping and retaining that small level of stormwater on site so that doesn't get to the streams, does a lot, not just for our aquifers, but also for water quality and for flood attenuation. Recognizing, of course, in the rules that this is not always going to be possible. You might have soil conditions that don't allow that. You might have contamination on site. You might have site constraints, physical, economic, there's a whole suite of things that might make this not practicable. And so the rule addresses that. But where it can be done, we feel it should be done. And then the third piece to this closes sort of a gap in our freshwater wetlands rules. So today, if you need a flood hazard permit or a coastal zone management permit, and that project is a major development, then you need to meet the stormwater rules for that whole project, even if only a little part of that project is within the state's jurisdiction. So you might have a 100-unit residential subdivision and one building is in the floodplain and you need a permit for that building and the outfall structure or whatever else. We look today at the entire development to make sure that it meets the standards of our stormwater management rules. The freshwater wetlands rules, though, are written differently. It says that the activity under the general permit has to be major development. So that means that within the wetlands or transition area, you'd have to have an acre of disturbance or a quarter acre of motor vehicle surface or impervious surface to trigger stormwater management. And for GP11 for discharges, it's a little different, but for everything else, you could have, say, a road crossing, and the road crossing could be part of a 100-acre development, but the road crossing itself only disturbs a small amount of wetlands or transition areas or open waters, and so it doesn't trigger stormwater review on the wetlands permit. So it's a very odd situation because we could have a flood hazard permit and a wetlands permit for the same thing, and the flood hazard permit looks at stormwater and the wetlands doesn't, or in worst case is that you only need a wetlands permit and it's not triggering our stormwater rules. So this rulemaking would make all the rules the same and say, if you come to us for a permit and that permit is for an activity that is a major development or associated with a major development, then you need to meet the stormwater rules. There are a couple changes where we have looked at our riparian zone protections. The riparian zone is that land that's 50 feet, 150 feet, or 300 feet outward from the top of bank along riverine systems and in certain coastal systems. And we want to improve protections in those areas in a couple different ways. One is there are situations where the rules look at streams that drain less than 50 acres, and it focuses on mostly streams that drain over 50 acres, but it says if you have a naturally occurring stream with bed and bank that are discernible, you get a riparian zone. You don't get a floodplain, but you get a riparian zone. But it has to be connected to another water, another surface water. So we've seen in areas like in karst topography or other geologic formations where you have a channel that is formed well and it drains 30, 40 acres and then it just disappears into the ground and then it pops up a few hundred feet downstream and it goes into another water that's regulated. So we want to capture those headwater areas and put riparian zone protections around those. And the second piece is we kind of have an odd situation along the barrier islands. So if you look at today's flood hazard rules and the coastal zone management rules, it says if you're on a barrier island, the oceans, not only does the ocean side not get a riparian zone, which is appropriate, we believe, but the bay side of the barrier island also does not get a riparian zone. So what you have is a situation, say along Barnegat Bay, which is a Category 1 water, where you have a 300-foot buffer on the mainland side of the bay and no buffer, no riparian zone on the bay side on the barrier island side of the bay. And so this fixes that and says if you're on a barrier island, you don't get along the ocean, you don't get a riparian zone. Actually, anywhere in the state, you don't get on the ocean a riparian zone. But on the inland side of the barrier islands and the bays and the islands in between, you would get a riparian zone, which we think is appropriate to protect water quality. There are some improvements also to the freshwater wetlands and transition area standards that we have. We want to clarify that applicants should demonstrate that impacts to wetlands are necessary for the conduct of a project. That discussion generally happens in the course of permits, but it's not explicit in the rules, so we want to make sure that it's clear. Where there's vernal habitats on site, we want an on-site assessment about what kind of impacts to those areas are proposed in vernal habitats, like under GP6. And if you know in the flood hazard rule, it talks about redevelopment activities within 25 feet of the top of bank and requires restoration of that area or it's sort of an investigation of what you can and can't do in that area. We want to import those same standards into our freshwater wetlands rules. So if you're looking for a transition area waiver, special activity waiver in the transition area, you need to be at least 25 feet away from freshwater wetlands. And if you're redeveloping that area between and you're going into the wetlands, we would seek to have you restore that land. So let's say a pavement that goes right up to the wetlands limit, we'd ask you to pull it back 25 feet. Again, recognizing that you might not be able to for the access to the site or because there's contaminated soil or there's erosion or there's any other things that are going on there. But to the extent you can, we'd like you to pull it back 25 feet and start restoring some of those transition areas, which kind of speaks to our overall goal of not just keeping the status quo, but trying to make things better. The rules in large look at saying, here's our resources. You can have this impact to this resource. And as long as it doesn't exceed certain limits, we're gonna believe that there's not going to be a cumulative impact in the watershed. But we haven't seen that play out. And so we want to try to find places where we can improve things so that development activities and redevelopment activities can actually make things better. And then the last piece is if you have an averaging plan and you're modifying the transition area, we're going back to what we had in the past where the entire modified transition area would have to be placed under a conservation restriction and not just the pieces that were added to it. Two more things under this heading, and then I want to try and make sure that we have time for questions. One is improving habitat protection. So there's two things here. One is that today there's a general permit in the flood hazard rules for in-kind replacement of bridge and culverts. And there's some flexibility in what's in-kind that allows slight deviations to it. And this kind of speaks to the way that we've looked at things historically, where, okay, you've got a bridge or a culvert, you need to replace it. because you're widening the road, or it's in disrepair, or any number of reasons why you want to. If you put things back generally the same geometry as what's there now, you're not going to cause flooding upstream to get worse, and you're not going to cause flooding downstream to get worse, right? There might be flooding upstream and downstream, but your bridge or culvert shouldn't make that worse. But by creating this general permit, we've pretty much incentivized in not making things better, right? And one place where we already try to make things better is with aquatic, low flow aquatic fish passage, right? So if you have a flat bottom concrete box, culvert, or bridge with a concrete bottom, and aquatic species are not able to go from one side to another, we already try to address that. But this goes one step further and looks at species, threatened endangered species habitat fragmentation. So a roadway can fragment, cut off one piece of threatened endangered species habitat from another. And so species want to get from one side of the road to the other so that they can find mates, so they can find food sources and whatnot. And so what ends up happening is in areas where habitat's fragmented by roadways or railroads, you have mortality of the species on the roadway because they're getting hit by vehicles. You're getting people swerving to get out of the way so they don't hit the vehicles, the species, and therefore hitting other vehicles or getting injuries. So we've seen impacts both to humans and to the species as a result. So what we want is if a bridge or culvert is being replaced, we want to see that means for species to go under the road are provided so that they don't have to go over the road to the extent possible. Now, that might mean making the bridge or culvert much bigger, which could make flooding downstream worse. We can't have that, but there's a balance there. And so again, this speaks to our intention to make things better and not just keep the status quo. And then finally, our mitigation requirements, right? So if you have riparian zone or freshwater wetlands impacts, you might buy credits from a wetlands bank, mitigation bank, or a riparian zone mitigation bank. Or you might be doing it on site, especially with riparian zones. You might be in a 300-foot riparian zone and you're cutting trees down here, and so you're planting trees down there to compensate. Well, where you put this mitigation effort and what it looks like shouldn't be based just on today's conditions, but also future conditions, right? If you're proposing a wetlands mitigation effort in an area that we're identifying is going to likely be underwater in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's not really going to mitigate the impacts of the wetlands loss. Same thing with riparian zones. Maybe it could be the type of species that are being used. So when mitigation projects are proposed, either through a bank or on site, we will be asking for an evaluation of how climate change might impact the long-term viability of that project. Might not have any impact, or it could have a significant impact, but we want to have that conversation. And then the last piece before we get to questions is our permitting process. And there are a few places here where this interacts with a lot of things that we've said already. You might be familiar, I'm sure most of you are on the call, with the concept of a permit by rule. Now, there's really two types of permits that are in our coastal zone management, freshwater wetlands, and flood hazard rules. There's permits that are adopted or promulgated as part of the rule, and then there's individual permits that have standards that the applicant has to demonstrate. So we often talk about, well, you need a general permit, you need GP11 for this activity, or you need whatever. Well, we're not actually issuing the general permit. The general permit is issued as part of the permit, as part of the rules. We're issuing you an authorization under the general permit, because what you're doing is you're demonstrating to the state, yeah, I meet all the standards that are in this rule that's been promulgated, and we're issuing this authorization, say, yep, you meet it, you can go ahead, here's your permit, here's your authorization. Well, permits by rule, though, are a bit of a problem, because permits by rule, they live in the rule, but there's no requirement to come to the department for anything. So what ends up happening is that a lot of activities, all the activities pretty much under any permits by rule, and there's 63 or 64 in the flood hazard rule, and there's another 20 something in the coastal rule. So there's like 90 something of these permits by rules. We don't really have a way to track them. We don't know when people are doing them. We don't know if people are doing them right. So what we're doing in this rulemaking is converting those permits by rule to permits by registration. And what that means is it's a new type of authorization. It's very similar to the permit by rule. It might be identical in the standard itself, but rather than a person just going ahead and doing it, you'd have to go online to a portal that we would create, spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes giving some very basic information that you'll be prompted to: property owner, responsible party, lot and block, address, phone number, which permit by registration you're undertaking, your anticipated timeline. You hit send, it puts it into DEP's database. It gives you a file number. It creates a PDF that says, thank you for registering for this permit by registration. Please give this to your town. You give that to your town when you get your building permit, or if you need to. If you're a federal state entity, then you can put it in your record and say, we've registered for this activity. And that does a few things. It alerts us that this is happening, so we can send inspectors out to look at it. We can report to FEMA what's being done in the special flood hazard area, because one thing FEMA asks us to do as the community, the state of New Jersey, is to say, show us the activities that you've authorized in the special flood hazard area. And we can't do that if we don't know where they are. So that enables us to run reports, and it enables us also to track the trends in a watershed. We might see that in a given watershed that there's increasing impairments, and we might see that there's a huge development pressure in that watershed, and maybe a lot of it is being undertaken under permits by registration. And so that's a way for us to adjust the rules and focus it on a watershed-wide basis. But the first step is collecting the data. So as I mentioned, it allows better tracking and reporting, and lets us go out there so that we can inspect it and see that it's done right. The second piece of this is permits by certification. We ran a report on which ones are used, and some are used a lot, and some were almost never used. There were some that I think 1 or 2 were issued in the whole time that the permit by certification lived in the rules. So that speaks to us that the activities are too narrow under the permit by certification. So in some cases, we're expanding the activities. Some cases, we're folding them into general permits and broadening it so that a larger range of activities can be utilized. And because of some of this expansion and the fact that a lot of this relates to flooding and floodproofing, we are saying that in any case where there's a flood hazard permit by certification, and for the coastal ones that have a component related to flooding, that either a licensed professional engineer or a licensed architect, registered architect, would be the ones to apply for the permit by certification. And we think that's appropriate for a few reasons. The permits by certification will ask questions like, are you in a floodway? Is your floor of your building 1 foot above? Is your road elevated? So on and so on and so on. And these are things that we've noticed that a number of the users, single family homeowners and whatnot, can't really speak to, right? So just as a matter of, this is anecdotal, but the very first permit by certification we ever received in the flood hazard rules, when we first adopted them a few years back, was for someone that we told was in the floodway, and they didn't qualify for a permit by certification because they were in a floodway, and they registered for this permit by certification, and the system spit out a permit by certification because they said, I'm not in the floodway. So we had to go back and fix that. So by having licensed engineers or architects be the ones that shepherd this, we believe that the information is going to be better, and then it protects the permittee as well. And then this is the last slide before we go to questions. So we have about a half an hour for questions. Improved noticing requirements, such as making sure that people let us know through that online portal when they're starting construction for all permits, so we can send people out there. Also, post-permit interactions with the state. We might issue a permit that says within 90 days you have to do X, Y, Z. You have to provide notification of this or proof of such and such. And unless the permit writer at the state remembers that and recognizes it and keeps track of it, it's not going to happen. And so then sometimes we see years later where these deed restrictions weren't filed, and now we have a problem. So the system can be automated so that you can upload these things right into their database if it's required. And if you didn't upload it within the prescribed time, the system can send you an email and say, hey, you got a permit, and within 90 days you were supposed to do X, Y, and Z. Please log on within the next 30 days. And then it can alert the permit writer, and we can look at the activity and make sure that it's being done correctly. Same thing with completion. We spend a lot of time crafting permits that have detailed conditions and requirements to make sure that the rules are met, and then we send the permit on its way, and sometimes we don't know if the thing was ever built or whether it was built correctly. There could be as-built drawings that were prepared that we should see if they're available. Photos of it, just to kind of make a record that something was done. And this protects the permittee as well, because 10, 20 years down the road, sometimes it's hard to tell what was actually built, but if there's a record of it, then it's helpful to all of us. And then finally, as I mentioned, an automatic response from the online system if the things aren't received in a timely manner. Your permit it's 5 years in and you haven't submitted a construction notice that you're starting to work, you get a notice from the system, hey, your permit's about to expire and we haven't received construction. Are you building? What's your plan, and so on. So again, I know I went through everything very quickly. Hopefully there's enough time for questions. There's a lot to cover here and I wanted to give as much information as I could. So now it's your turn.
All right, great. We'll open it up to questions. Just a reminder, we may limit questions to 2 minutes apiece, and we will be ending promptly at 12:30. It's 25 minutes from now. So, okay, we have Stephen Morey.
Steve, I'm wondering if maybe you're muted because I think the default is everybody was
I
muted.
was muted. I'm always the one that does that.
No, I'm always doing that too.
Good morning.
How you doing? Happy holidays.
You too. The one thing that really perked my ears up is the riparian zone being applied to barrier islands. How is that going to be applied to lagoons, bulkheaded lagoons, and other bulkheaded sites, and those sites that are not already bulkheaded? How is the riparian zone going to help when you would likely have wetland transition areas, wetland buffers, and other special areas that are already going to heavily regulate that site? How is this riparian zone thing going to be helpful, and will it apply to bulkheaded sites?
So that's a great question. So currently, and we would keep this requirement, is that if you have activities along a man-made lagoon, human-made lagoon, then it doesn't trigger those riparian zone requirements. So that would remain. So this is looking at the natural shoreline of the barrier islands on the bay side of them, right? So if there's a bulkhead, it does apply if it's a natural shoreline. But the riparian zone standards are generally there's some setbacks to it, but there's some deviations from the setbacks. Like in the coastal rules, you can get closer to the top of bank than you could in a riverine system. And if it's already developed, which largely a lot of these are, then there's not going to be much impact in some cases along the barrier islands. So this is trying to protect those natural shorelines and the vegetation that might be there. And it also addresses situations where, let's say you're discharging stormwater from a development into Barnegat Bay, and you're not in the riparian zone. Well, technically, you're not triggering the 95% TSS removal rate is tied into you discharging within the 300-foot riparian zone, and so you don't get that requirement, right? So you end up having different water quality standards on the barrier islands versus the mainland, even though it's the same water. So I don't see that this will be an impedance to development, but I do think that it will protect things that need to be protected.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
And just a reminder, I don't think I mentioned it at the beginning, we are going to be posting the slides and the presentation on the website, just to short circuit any questions like that. All right, we now have Valerie Bogart.
Hi,
Morning,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good morning. Okay, great. I'm from Somerset County, and can you clarify a little bit more? You said you're looking to get rid of the general permit for in-kind replacement of a bridge or culvert. Is that only in instances where there's a threatened and endangered species, or I'm not sure which GP you're talking about, the GP9 and GP10. It almost sounded like if we need to, do a basic bridge replacement, that we would automatically need an individual permit.
Yeah, that's a great question, and as it's contemplated now, that would be the case, that we would remove that GP and then you would need an individual permit. That doesn't necessarily mean that the standards are how do I put this? That doesn't necessarily mean that like the hydraulics or the standards related to that are necessarily going to change. But the problem is that through the general permit, there's no real opportunity to make things better. And one way that we can make things better is by flood amelioration. I've seen situations where you had bridges that were, there was a bridge in Mercer County that we looked at not that long ago that was not that far from the Delaware River, and there was upstream flooding from that bridge. And if they opened it up, they would cause slightly more flooding downstream, but it went right into the Delaware River, and then it wouldn't cause any flooding there. So there could be a real benefit by opening up that structure. You know, because if we're saying that we're anticipating higher flow rates, if we're looking at more frequency of these impactful storms, then we think that there should be a conversation about how we can make things better. So I'm going to extrapolate a little bit. I'm going to guess that your point maybe was that keep the GP if it's not a habitat issue, but if there's a habitat issue, maybe not. Is that kind of what you were thinking, or I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think in all circumstances that you should get rid of that GP. I think in some certain circumstances, it's pretty clear that if you would open up that bridge, that you're going to cause downstream flooding. You know, you're going to raise it greater than 0.2 feet, and maybe you don't have a, T&E issue. That GP is still a valid, good to have without having to go for an individual permit to prove that, if you know what I mean, from the county's perspective. We have a lot of bridges, so. Yeah,
no, that I think that's a great point. I'm going to take a deeper look at that and think about ways that we can maybe improve that. And I just want to also remind everyone that the offer stands that after the new year, we're happy to meet with individuals or groups that want to talk about what this might look like for their suite of projects. I think the counties would have a lot of interest in understanding how this works, or DOT or other agencies. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll make sure that we have that conversation. But I think you raised really, really great points. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vince.
All right, and just to follow up on that, if you do want to have one of those breakout sessions, if you could just email Vince, his email is on the screen, and let him know generally what sorts of issues you want to talk about so we can group them together. Okay, we have Alex Ambrose.
Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, thank you. So I just wanted to say first how exciting this is to hear this. I think this has been a while in the making, and it's obvious that you folks have put a lot of work into this. An important report I just wanted to lift up is that New Jersey has the most affordable housing units exposed to sea level rise, and we knew that back in 2020. And it's more than New York and Massachusetts by a long shot. So this is not just an environmental issue, it's also a justice issue that, making sure that any new housing and any new infrastructure reflects the realities of the 21st century, and looking forward instead of looking backwards when we're thinking about future-proofing our state is essential to, just achieving the justice that both the governor and I think everyone on this call is looking for. So just wanted to say we're excited to see the science behind this as well, and to talk with you more about it. So thank you, Vince.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. I appreciate that very much, and I agree with you.
Claudia Roca.
Hey, Claudia.
Hi, Vince. How are you?
Doing well.
PSE&G. Similar to the county comment, just with some concerns regarding the conversion of some of the permit by rules to permits by registration. I know we talked about this a little bit before, especially when if they're caveated not in a riparian zone, for example, and items that really have no impact to flooding, like wood utility poles or underground utilities when everything's being done underground, or things not really applicable to us, but surveying, milling and repaving, if the department would take a closer look at some of those permit by rules, I think they've been very beneficial in the past. And I think it would be great to keep some of those, especially where there's essentially no impacts to flooding.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I appreciate the conversations that we've had about this. And you're right. If you look at today's flood hazard permits by rule, for example, permit by rule number 1 is normal property maintenance, and that includes things like mowing your lawn. And I've joked about this many times, so forgive me if you probably all heard this already, but where I live near Category 1 water, and my entire property is within the riparian zone. So if we converted this to a permit by registration, every time I mow my lawn, I would have to go on and register, and that's not what we're trying to do here, right? So there are some limited exemptions that we're placing in the flood hazard rule that speak to like maintenance activities, things that, mowing your lawn or replacing a telephone pole that's been damaged or, decayed, or, and like you said, qualifications about like it's not in the floodplain, it's not in the riparian zone, or it's whatever. Milling and repaving, anything that falls into that category, we have some limited exemptions that wouldn't be required to be notified through the permit by registration system. But if you're building something new, right, you're constructing something or you're having impacts to a resource, that's the kind of things that we would look at through the permit by registration.
Doug O'Malley.
Hey, Doug.
Hey, Vince, how are you? Thank you again for you and your team for kind of putting this presentation together. I will say, I guess we're all getting very familiar with the last slide here of the rainfall and the girl with her hand out. So kind of a good reminder. We've been through this a couple times now.
Yes.
But it is the end of the year. Obviously, the holidays are upon us. Just wanted to thank obviously the work of DEP to get the inland flooding rule in the register, and then obviously the next step on a coastal flooding as well. And I had kind of two comments and questions, I guess. One, just to go back on first off, thank you for using Flood Mapper, right? I feel like that's such a powerful tool. And you were referencing obviously the sea level rise research that DEP partnered with Rutgers on. You referenced the kind of the upper limit of sea level rise of up to 5 feet. And I just wanted a little clarification because the higher emissions, it's still within the likely range, gets up to 6 feet. And obviously this is based on science within the last decade. What's the kind of plan for the department to continue to, to reflect the science on the ground, especially sea level rise projections increase? So that's one question. And then I guess the second one, and you kind of obliquely referenced this when you were looking at not just sea level rise, but obviously the flood hazard area. Obviously, the department put together the extreme precipitation protection tool, which literally can be used not only by counties, but by towns. This is an incredible tool that kind of brings home to municipalities the increases in rainfall. I'm just curious on just the outreach the department is using to kind of use the rainfall data that it has and what rainfall data will look like in the future to kind of bring this home and localize it for towns as they're looking at the rule. So two easy ones there, right?
Yes, they're really easy. Well, so the first one, before I forget it all. So as you know, the Rutgers staff report, it has different permutations of like likelihood that sea level rise will increase by a certain amount, right? So for example, it says that there's a 50%, assuming that there's low, moderate, and high emissions levels, right? So we have been focusing on the moderate emissions levels because of the standards that we are adopting through our air quality program and also things that we've been partnering with other states in the region. So we kind of picked that moderate, which basically means everything's staying the same. It's not getting worse, so it's not getting better from an emissions scenario. And then within that, there's an 83% chance that sea level rise will be at least 2.1 feet, a 50% chance that it'll beat or exceed 3.3 feet, a 17% chance that it'll exceed 5.1 feet, and I think a 5% chance that it will exceed 6.7 feet, I think is the numbers, right? So that inner kind of 2/3 of the statistics is what we're saying is the likely range from a statistical analysis. So we're saying that the likely range of sea levels between 2.1 and 5.1, and we're taking the high end of it and saying, well, we don't want it just to be a flip of a coin. And if we take that 50% value, we'd basically be saying to everybody, yeah, make everything 3.3 feet higher, and there's a 50% chance that that's not high enough, right? That's not good odds. So that's kind of, I think that's kind of where your question was, right? Like,
I just wanted you to kind of talk through. I know you've referenced that before on the 50% chance. We want to be most protective, obviously. Even in that moderate emission scenario, there's still higher numbers that we're assuming we're not going to get to. So I mainly
Right.
just wanted to make that point.
Right.
That even
Right.
within the DEP projections, this is still quote unquote conservative.
Right, and you're right, because like if it's a high emission scenario, and that 5% exceedance, it's like 8.8 feet, I think is what the number was, and I think that was maybe even on the slide. So yeah, it's actually true. Now that your second question about precipitation, can you remind me what
Yeah,
the
I mean,
what the
really,
question was?
it's just referencing the tool that DEP has, but also the science that was went through the advisory board conducted by Cornell, and I just wanted to get a better sense of kind of the same question in some ways of one, how to make sure that towns are getting that data and using it, but also how increases in extreme precipitation will be reflected once presumably the rule is adopted.
Mm-hmm. So I think the main mechanism for that would be that, in the current rulemaking that's on the street right now, there's the numbers and the references are put into a table in the stormwater rules in 7:8. And so each town has to adopt a stormwater control ordinance, which would point to 7:8, and they have to at least meet that standard. So that's the primary way. But we are working on our website in the sense that we want better interactions with people. We want our website to be a resource, source, so that people can go to and find out precipitation, find out model ordinances and so on and so on and so on. So I think the main way though is going to be through that stormwater control ordinance.
Got it. Thanks. Thanks for that clarity.
Sure. Thanks, Doug.
Mike Pizarro.
Hey, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Vince. Appreciate this presentation. Going back to the stormwater, greatly appreciate talking about redevelopment and adding the water quality standards. So my question really, I have two parts. Is the on-site retention standard going to apply to redevelopment as well as greenfield development? And also with the quantity controls, if I understand it right, and I'm always learning, but all you have to really do is match the peak rates of the pre-proposal to post-development. So if you have a site that is, 100%, 90% impervious, matching a high rate of velocity doesn't really do anything. And one of our big problems I've been hearing is, a lot of our streams and the sedimentation is because the streams are beating themselves out with the increased volume and rate. So are we also going to do a rate reduction requirement for redevelopment?
Yeah, Mike, those are great questions. And you're right. Like I said before, that we're not going to address our existing existing flooding problems, stormwater problems, or water quality problems unless we start looking at these projects, right? So, the classic slide that I'd use in other ones when we talked about the inland flood protection was Route 202 in Flemington. Route 202 in Flemington there's no river or creek or anything anywhere near it, but it became a river because all the runoff from all the historic development in Flemington went to the road and it became the conveyance. So the water quality, so I don't know how to explain it. So the trigger for major development would be amended so that it would capture these redevelopment activities. Okay, so it would subject the redevelopment activities to the whole suite of things that are in the stormwater rules. Okay, that means water quality. Now it means quantity if you're changing the timing, if you're changing the volume of water and the timing of water, right? So there still is that provision, which I think you're speaking to, where if you show us the existing hydrograph and say, this is the runoff from the site today, and here's the runoff from the site tomorrow, and we're matching or below that, then you don't have to go further and further reduce, right? So we're kind of looking at that as to what that looks like, but right now the rule doesn't have that direct component in it. But I appreciate your point about, if we don't start retaining that water, how's it going to make things better? Now, the on-site retention will help that too, though, especially with the smaller storm, like the 2-year storm and less.
So I mean, I would recommend DP to sort of have a standard in there that says you take a look at the natural condition of that land pre any development and assume that it is in a wooded good condition unless historical data, suggest otherwise. So if it was always a field, okay, it's going to be a field, or a meadow. That way you get to an actual rate reduction as well. So
Good point.
But I
Yeah.
appreciate it, and obviously we'll be talking again in next year.
Sounds good.
So
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left. That's probably time for one more question if anybody has any questions.
Guess I can stop sharing my my screen of the girl in the water there.
I'm not seeing anything.
Right. Well, and everyone's tired. I certainly am from the holiday season alone. Again, it means a lot that so many people spend 90 minutes of their Monday talking about this issue. I'm glad that you all agree that it's important. It's iterative, so we want to have those conversations. We want to make this as best as we can. The rulemaking, we want it to be successful. We want it to address everything it should, and so please take us up on that offer to meet with us in January. We want to have those conversations and look for places that we can improve it. And with that, I thank you very much. I wish you all a happy Hanukkah, happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you, Vince.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Happy holidays.
Thanks, Vince.
Thank you.
Thank you.